Joshua Greene is an experimental psychologist, neuroscientist, and philosopher. He studies the infrastructure of complex thought and moral judgment, decision-making, primarily using behavioral experiments and functional neuroimaging. His other interests include religion and cooperation. He is the author of Moral Tribes, Emotion, Reason, and the Gap Between Us and Them. At Harvard, he's taught many undergrad and graduate courses, I assume, and I've heard from the undergrads especially that he does a very great and persuasive job helping spread the ideas of altruism. So, would everyone please give a warm welcome to Professor Greene.
Okay, well, thank you very much. It's really a great pleasure to be here. I'm a huge fan of the effective altruism movement, and I'm just so glad that you're all devoting your energy to this. Not just a good cause, but I think the best possible cause. What I'm going to do today is I'm going to talk about some new research that I think adds a new kind of philosophical twist to people's thinking about moral dilemmas, and perhaps could be useful in getting people to make better decisions depending on what you think better is. So this is work that's done in collaboration with Karen Huang, who's really the lead on this work, and Karen happens to be sitting right there, and Max Bazerman of Harvard Business School. And I should also say that some of the ideas that I'll be talking about were independently developed by a philosopher at MIT named Caspar Hare, who also happens to be an old friend of mine from grad school, and I won't have a chance to sort of go into the details about that, but I wanted to give a shout out for Caspar for his own thinking about applying some of Rawlsian thinking to moral dilemmas. Okay, so there are two features of the values behind the effective altruism movement that I want to highlight. So one is the idea of making decisions in a more impartial way, and in particular making decisions that are less egocentric, so putting not just value on your own well-being, but the well-being of others, and value on, and being less what I call tribalistic, that is putting value on people who are not just members of your specific group or groups, but instead putting as much as possible equal weight on the well-being of all people. This is beautifully captured by the idea of Peter Singer's expanding circle, that is, to think of moral progress as putting more and more weight on the well-being of people, and perhaps not even people, animals as well, that are more and more socially distant. And then this is on a philosophical level. On a psychological level, I think an important aspect of thinking in effective altruism, it has to do with what kind of thought process you're allowing to dominate your decision making. And so the joke sometimes is it's effective altruism, not affective. That is, making judgments based on the consequences as opposed to making judgments based on what feels like the right thing to do, or avoiding things because they might feel like the wrong thing to do. And this is kind of the moral ideal, but this is what a lot of my own research has focused on, using kind of stylized moral dilemmas from the philosophical tradition, and I'll say a little bit more about that. Okay. Oh, animation failed. Okay, ignore that for now. One of the sort of philosophical ideas in the bagground comes from the philosophy pioneered by Jeremy Bentham and John Stuart Mill, known awfully, I think it's a terrible name for it, is utilitarianism. And you can think of utilitarianism as essentially giving answers to two different questions. So one is, who really matters? And their answer is everybody equally, and that sort of is the impartial aspect of the philosophy. And then the more distinctive aspect of it is what really matters, and what the utilitarians conclude is something like happiness, or if you want to be sort of a bit more precise, the overall quality of experience is what ultimately matters. And so the conclusion that the philosophy reaches is that we should be maximizing happiness impartially. Now, some people like Peter Singer are effective altruists because they are utilitarians. Others are effective altruists with other philosophical influences behind them, or perhaps without necessarily a single coherent moral philosophy. An alternative way of thinking about moral decisions comes from John Rawls, who shares the idea that justice or fairness or good moral decision making is impartial. So agrees that everybody matters equally. but has a different answer to this question of what really matters. And from a Rawlsian perspective, the idea is that what matters is what people would choose or what people would agree on. So a good outcome from Rawls's perspective is what's just or what's fair or what's good for a society is what the society would choose if the people in that society didn't know who they were going to be. If they were choosing impartially because they were denied information that they could use to bias their judgments about what society should look like in their favor. And I'll say a bit more about that. So the sort of Rawlsian conclusion is we should choose what we would choose if we were choosing impartially. And interestingly, so John Harsanyi, who's an economist, won the Nobel Prize for his work on game theory. I don't want to say dabbled a bit in philosophy because I think that his ideas were actually quite deep, but did spend some time thinking about broader philosophical issues. And he came to the conclusion that there actually isn't a disagreement after all between the utilitarian perspective and the Rawlsian perspective. That is, he made the argument that if we were choosing impartially, what we'd end up choosing to do as a society is to create a society that maximizes happiness. And the work I'm going to tell you about today has a kind of Harsanyian flavor. That is, that we're getting people to think in a sort of Rawlsian way, but at least in a local kind of way, leading to a utilitarian kind of conclusion. So I assume all of this group is familiar with kind of Peter Singer's argument that essentially started the effective altruism movement many decades ago. That is, if there's a child right in front of you who's drowning, you wouldn't say, I'm not going to save this child because I'm worried about ruining my clothes and losing a couple of $100 or whatever it is that you're wearing. Depends on how fancy you dress. But we ordinarily think it's okay to say, well, I'd rather keep my money for things like nicer clothes instead of donating them to people who are in just as desperate need. And Singer famously asked, does that really make sense? Intuitively, it seems like you have to save the child who's drowning in front of you, but not the children who are drowning in poverty on the other side of the world. And he argued that those things are not as different as you might think, as you know. I just want to tell you a little bit. This is an old experiment, kind of forever in prep for reasons I won't get into. Done with Jay Musin, where we sort of took the Peter Singer thought experiment and tightened it up a little bit, and kind of following the philosopher Peter Unger in terms of the background. So in our story, we told people, imagine that you are vacationing in this faraway country and it's sort of beautiful but poor country. You have your little cottage up in the mountains overlooking the coast where there's the village down below or the city down below, and a terrible storm has struck, or a tsunami or a hurricane, and there's devastation along the coast. People are desperately in need of clean water and food. We ask them, if you're there, do you have an obligation to help? And it turns out the best way to help is not to go down there yourself, but your internet still works. Just make a donation to the Red Cross or whoever's there on the ground. And in another version of this, we asked people, we described the situation as being exactly the same, but we said your friend is in this faraway country, you're here still in the United States, and you can see everything that they can see. They've got a live feed going on Facebook, and you're in just as good a position to help. You can make a donation to the Red Cross. The only difference is here you're close and here you're far away. And when we gave people the close version, 68% of people said you have an obligation to make a donation, whereas when people were presented with this case as being far away, half as many people did. And this sort of, I think, illustrates the kind of bugginess in our thinking. That if you say, should you save these people's lives, very few people would say, well, how many feet away are they, right? But that is essentially the difference here. This is a study done with Amitai Shenhav, where we gave people what we call rescue dilemmas like this. So you're in this rescue boat, and you're going to save this person who's drowning, and then you get a message that says, wait, there are these other people over here, and you could change course and try to save them. And what we did in this experiment is we varied the number of lives that you could save, and also the probability that you would actually be able to save them, and asked and tried to get a sense for when would people be willing to save course, or to change course, depending on what you might call the expected moral value, so the outcome and the probability. And this was a brain imaging experiment. We were trying to understand how the brain is keeping track of the magnitude and the probability and integrating those things. I'll mention the brain results just very briefly next, but that's not the main thing I want to focus on. One of the things that we saw, which has been documented over and over again, is a kind of what you might think of, at least from our perspective, moral innumeracy. That is, that as you get more and more lives that you can save, the value of each additional life seems to go down. So if you can save 1 or 2 people, each life seems to be worth a lot, and then get up to 10, 20, 30, 50, etc. It's almost like, I'm getting kind of full. Like I've already saved a few people, and those additional lives don't mean don't matter quite as much. And part of what was interesting about our results is that the parts of the brain that seem to be keeping track of the value of these lives that you can save is the basic mammalian reward circuitry that we and other animals use for making decisions about things like food. So if a rat is trying to decide, should I eat the stuff I have right here or go for the really good stuff that's far away but I might not get it or I might not make it back, that the same basic reward circuitry, this is a part of the brain called the ventral striatum, that's integrating information about the magnitude of the reward and the probability. It's the same thing that's keeping track of these number of lives. And so that kind of begins to give a kind of computational and neural explanation for our innumeracy. That is, if this circuitry evolved for keeping track of things like food, where those things tend to have they tend to exhibit diminishing returns. Once you've already eaten a lot, you're kind of full, and having more food is not going to do you much good. And then we kind of intuitively apply, I think, or at least it's a hypothesis, the same kind of thinking when it comes to saving people's lives, but from a different perspective. Why should the 100th life that you can save be worth any less than the first or the second life that you can save? So this is another way, I think, in which our thinking is kind of buggy. A lot of the work that I've done over the years has involved these sort of trolley dilemmas, and the interesting finding, or these sort of the puzzle that begins all this research is if you ask people, is it okay to hit a switch so that you turn this trolley away from these 5 people and onto 1 person, most people will say that that's okay. But if you ask people, is it okay to push this big guy off of the footbridge so that you can stop the trolley from saving 5 people, so it's again trading 1 life for 5, then people tend to say no. And a lot of research indicates that it has to do with an emotional response to this kind of action. And while in general I'm not in favor of pushing people in front of speeding trolleys, I think the more relevant point is that there can be something buggy in our thinking if we're relying too much about our feelings about which particular actions feel wrong or feel obligatory. And on this, I'll just mention one sort of result, kind of highlighting the sort of bizarreness of purely affective decision making. So this is a version of the footbridge case. You can push the guy with the big backpack off of the footbridge and onto the tracks. Here, in this sample, 30% of people say that it's okay to do this. If you change it so that instead of pushing the guy with your hands, you hit a switch that will drop the guy through a trap door, now about twice as many people say that it's okay. And it really seems to be something about the nature of the action. Again, it makes sense that it's good that we have negative emotional responses to committing acts to basic personal acts of violence, but we don't necessarily want our moral thinking to be dominated by how actions feel. So to kind of turn this around, imagine this admittedly even more far-fetched case. So the trolley is now headed down these tracks, and some idiot left a box of explosives on top of this dam. And if you don't push the guy off the footbridge, the dam's going to blow, the city's going to be flooded, and 1 million people are going to die. Is it okay to push the guy to save 1 million people? 70% of people say yes, which means 30% of people say no. And statistically, this is in this sample, it's not statistically different from the case where 63% say that it's okay to drop the guy with the switch, which means that the difference between pushing with your hands and hitting a switch is something like 1 million lives. That is, that feeling of this is a wrong thing to do when you actually have to push, changing that from a push to a switch is about the same difference in judgment as you get by adding 1 million lives into the decision. Okay, so the thought is that maybe applying a Rawlsian kind of approach to moral decision making could get people to make better moral decisions. Of course, what counts as better or worse is going to be contentious, but better at least from a certain perspective. So Rawls is wearing the blindfold here, and what that represents is this idea of the the veil of ignorance. So what Rawls was focused not on specific moral dilemmas, but on general questions about the organization of society. And what Rawls said was, imagine that all of the people who were in a society were stripped of their knowledge about what positions in society they occupy. So whether your race or your religion, whether you're young or old or able or disabled or smart or not so smart or attractive or not so attractive, you're on the other side of this wall, behind or this veil, I should say. And these people have to decide what they want their society to be like without knowing those particular features. Now, Rawls came to a decidedly non-utilitarian conclusion about this. That is one option on the table that he considers is maybe these people would say, well, let's set up our society in a way so that overall happiness is maximized. For reasons I won't get into, he rejects that conclusion and comes to a very different conclusion. But what I want to do here is apply this idea of looking at a situation and saying, what would you want to have happen, even from a selfish perspective, if you didn't know who you were going to be, right? The idea is that this procedure embodies a kind of impartiality. That is, if you don't have any information that you could use to bias the decision, then whatever decision you would make, even if you're just trying to make things go as well for yourself as possible, that would be a fair or a just decision. So let's apply this to our old friend, the Trolley footbridge case. So when we Rawlsify it, we say, okay, this person has to decide, do I push this guy or not? And there's a 5 out of 6 chance that you'll be one of these people on the tracks. And there is a 1 out of 6 chance that you'll be the trolley stopper. And so if the decision maker pushes, you have a 1 out of 6 chance of dying and a 5 out of 6 chance of living. If the decision maker decides not to push, then you have a 1 out of 6 chance of living and a 5 out of 6 chance of dying. So then we just ask people, just from a purely selfish perspective, but an impartial perspective, because you don't know who you're going to be, what would you want the person to do? And what we found that 64% of people say that they would rather have the person push, which is really, in a sense, not very surprising. That is, you have a 5 out of 6 chance of living. In fact, in some ways, it's surprising that only 64% of people would say, I'd rather have a 5 out of 6 chance of living than a 1 out of 6 chance of living. Okay, so this is kind of the Rawlsified trolley footbridge case. What we're doing, and we call this VOI, veil of ignorance. So now what we're doing is, people are going to respond to the original footbridge case in 2 ways. In one condition, they just respond to the footbridge case as usual. In the other condition, they first do the Rawlsified version of this. And then they say, okay, now consider a different question that's related, and they get the original footbridge case. So I want to be really clear about this. People are responding to the same question in both cases. It's just that in one case, they've come to it cold. And in the other case, they've gone through this exercise of thinking, in a similar situation like this, if I didn't know who I was going to be, what would I want the person to do? And what we find is that in the control condition, where they're just given the footbridge case, 25% of people say that it's okay, that it's acceptable to push the guy off the footbridge. But if they first considered this in this Rawlsian way, then not a huge jump, but significantly more people end up saying that it's morally acceptable to push the guy off the footbridge. Now, this is not my favorite case to illustrate this, because I don't think there's anything especially great about pushing people off of footbridges, but things get more interesting when we consider other cases that have more real-world applicability. I should say, for the experimental design geeks in the audience, you might think this is not really a very good control condition. There are a lot of things going on here. You're having people make a judgment. They're landing on a certain kind of conclusion. They might anchor on that conclusion. We've run other experiments where we rule out those kinds of deflationary explanations for this. So I won't go into those details, but we do have a more active control conditions that yield similar results. Okay, so now I want to talk about 2 different types of cases. One, the case of the ethics of self-driving cars, and then another case about a bioethical decision where you have to choose between saving some people versus others. So this case that we gave people was adapted from Jean-Francois Bonnefond and colleagues' paper from 2016, where they looked at situations like this. So the trolley, now it's a car, now it's a self-driving car, is headed for these people, and if not, and the car could either go straight, in which case it will end up killing these people, or it could swerve out of the way, in which case the passenger will be killed. So the decision that maximizes the total number of lives saved would be for the car to swerve, but not everybody is such a big fan of that. So in our version, there are 9 pedestrians who who can be saved by having the car swerve. In their study, what they find is that most people wouldn't want to ride in a car and wouldn't want there to be a policy in place that says that in situations like this, the self-driving car needs to swerve. So we ask people, what do you think of having a policy that says that cars should be utilitarian, essentially, in cases like this? That is, do the thing that's going to save the most lives, independent of whether those lives are people outside the car or people inside the car. In the control condition, about 59% of people approve of the policy. If you have them do the veil of ignorance version first, where you say, okay, imagine that you have a 9 out of 10 chance of being one of the pedestrians and a 1 out of 10 chance of being the passenger, would you rather have the car swerve and you have a 90% chance of living, or would you rather have the car go straight and you have a 10% chance of living? Almost everybody says, I'd rather have the car swerve, and I'd rather have that be the policy in general. And then when they do the Rawls version and then do the more basic version and they say, just what do you think of this policy? Now 83% of people say that they approve of the policy that would save more lives. Okay, this hospital case, the situation is there has been a terrible earthquake, and earthquake victims are being rushed to the hospital, and they're going to need oxygen for life-saving surgeries. There's a single patient who is already on oxygen, and that patient is using an enormous amount of oxygen, enough that could be used for, I think we used the number 9 again, 9 different surgeries. So if you keep the patient on the oxygen, then 9 patients won't have their surgeries and they'll die. But you could take the patient off the oxygen, use the oxygen for those surgeries, and then those 9 people will live. So again, the question is it morally acceptable to preserve the oxygen for the surgeries? And again, we either have them just respond to that question cold, or they first think about, would you want the hospital ethics board to say, okay, use the oxygen for more surgeries, in which case you would have a much greater chance of living? Or would you want the ethics board to say, no, you've got to keep that patient on the oxygen, even if that means the 9 people will die, so then in that case you have a 10% chance of living. And as before, control condition, in this case, is about 42% of people saying use the oxygen to save more lives. And the number goes up, not a ton, but significantly when people do the Rawls version beforehand. Finally, getting to the case that's most relevant for us. How are we doing on time, by the way?
It's tight.
Sorry? It's tight? Okay, sorry. I'll walk through this very quickly. So, this is a case about funds being used for cataract surgeries, either in India or other kinds of medical treatments in the United States. In this version, people get a description where basically it says you can make a $200 donation, and that will fund one person's surgery in the United States, and save them from going blind in one eye. Or the same donation can be used to provide two different people with surgery in India. Preventing those people from going blind. Which would you want the donation decision maker to do if you didn't know who? So who you're going to be. And again, the idea is that you have a 2 out of, in the Rawlsified version of this, you have a 2 out of 3 chance that you'll be one of these people, and a 1 out of 3 chance that you'll be this person. So you have a 2 out of 3 chance of living if the money goes to surgery in India instead of in the United States. As explained, and you know what's coming. 54% say that you should donate to the more effective charity, that is the one that's going to save 2 people in India instead of 1 in the US, when people just do this cold, but when they get the Rawlsian exercise beforehand, it goes up a lot. Again, not a huge amount, but a statistically significant amount. So, to summarize the results, Rawls has a kind of prescription for impartial moral thinking. And what these results suggest is that applying that kind of thinking to particular cases, including some important real-world decisions that need to be made, this can help people make decisions that lead to better consequences. Now, there's nothing in the psychological research that says that the outcomes, the decisions that people are making more often when they go through this Rawlsian exercise is better. That, of course, is up to you. But if you are a fan of having people make decisions that produce better consequences, then you might think this could be a useful tool, either philosophical or perhaps something that could even be used in a more real-world way to get people thinking more impartially and producing better results. So just wanted to say again, thanks to Karen and to Max. In my original version of this, I had like the equal arm balance with their disembodied heads and both of them. A little too gruesome, so I put them on the other side and veil a bigger. Anyway, thanks very much and looking forward to it.